My name is Amina. I am 70 years old, and I have lived my entire life in Nairobi, Kenya. These streets know me. These markets carry my footprints. These classrooms echo with my voice. For more than 40 years, I stood in front of a blackboard teaching children the alphabet, the poetry of our land, the mathematics of everyday survival. I was proud of being a teacher, because teachers raise generations. I thought my reward would come later, not in money, but in love, in respect, in the comfort of my own children. I imagined that when I grew old, I would not sit alone in a room. I imagined the laughter of my grandchildren, the warm greetings of my daughter, the feeling that I was still needed. But life does not always follow the stories we tell ourselves. Sometimes it breaks you in places you never thought possible. Sometimes, the betrayal that cuts deepest does not come from enemies but from the ones you carried in your womb, the ones whose first cries you silenced with lullabies, the ones you swore you would give your life for. I had only one daughter. From the day she was born, she was my treasure. I still remember her small fingers wrapped around mine, the way she would run to me when thunder roared at night. I built my whole world around her. Her father died when she was young, and I became both mother and father. I worked extra hours. I gave private lessons in the evenings. I skipped new clothes for myself, all so she could study in good schools, eat proper meals, and dream big. As the years passed, I managed to buy a small piece of land on the edge of the city and build a modest house. Every brick carried the sweat of my labor. I told myself, this is where I will rest one day. This is where my daughter will always find her home. I thought I was securing her future, not knowing I was digging the grave of my own trust. She grew into a woman, intelligent and ambitious. I was proud of her, even when she made choices I did not always agree with. She married a man from another city, and they had 2 children. I welcomed them into my heart, because I believed that families, no matter how different, must stand together. One afternoon, she came to me with a gentle smile. "Mama," she said, "if you transfer the title of the land and house into my name, it will make things easier. Paperwork becomes difficult as you get older. If the property is in my name, it will protect us all. Nothing will really change. You will live here until the end of your days. It is just a formality." I remember her words so clearly. I had never doubted her, not once in 70 years. She was my blood, my only child. Why would she deceive me? And so, with trembling hands and a mother's blind love, I signed the papers she brought. I did not even ask questions. I thought, everything I have is hers anyway. What difference does it make if the papers say her name instead of mine? For a few months, nothing seemed unusual. She still visited, though less often. She still smiled, though sometimes her eyes avoided mine. Then, one day, whispers reached me through a neighbor. "Your house is on sale," she said quietly, as though afraid of hurting me. I laughed. It sounded absurd. My house, my home, the place I built brick by brick. Impossible. But the whisper turned into a truth I could no longer deny. The documents were real. My daughter had already sold the land and the house. The money had been transferred. She and her husband were preparing to leave the country, to start a new life abroad. I confronted her. My voice shook. My heart begged for some explanation. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe she needed the money urgently and would soon return it. But she did not even meet my eyes. She told me I was old, that I would not understand, that she had to think of her children's future. Then she stopped answering my calls altogether. Days later, she was gone. Just like that. My only daughter, the one I raised with every drop of my strength, boarded a plane and left me in a rented one-room apartment, stripped not just of property but of dignity. I cannot describe the silence that followed. It was not the kind of silence that soothes. It was the silence of betrayal, the silence of walls that mock you because they do not belong to you anymore. I would sit on the iron bed in that tiny room and stare at the peeling paint, wondering how life could be so cruel. I had endured poverty, loneliness, and the weight of widowhood, but this was different. This was the wound that cut into my soul. I asked myself questions every night. Did I fail as a mother? Did I love her too much, or too little? Did I raise her in a way that made her selfish? Or was the world to blame for filling her heart with greed? I replayed every memory in my mind, every birthday I celebrated, every school fee I paid with trembling hands, every tear I wiped from her cheeks, and in the end, it all came down to one truth. I had given her everything, and she had taken everything away. I learned that betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives with a smile. Sometimes it wears the face you love most. And when it leaves, it does not just empty your home, it empties your heart. People in Nairobi looked at me with pity. Some whispered that I must have done something wrong for my child to abandon me. Others avoided me, afraid that my pain was contagious. A few kind souls offered comfort, but their words were like rain on stone. They could not sink deep enough to erase the fire burning inside me. Yet even in the middle of that darkness, a small voice inside me refused to die. Maybe it was the teacher in me, maybe it was the years of fighting through hardship, but I knew one thing: I would not end my days as a victim. I was 70, yes, but 70 years had taught me lessons no thief could steal. I knew how to read documents, how to follow trails, how to be patient. I had spent a lifetime teaching children to stand up for themselves. Now it was my turn to listen to my own lessons. I sat alone in that small room, and I whispered to myself, this is not the end. This is the beginning of something else. The days after my daughter left were heavy, as if the very air carried the weight of my disappointment. I would walk through the bustling streets of Nairobi, watching women in colorful kangas, balancing baskets on their heads, men shouting prices in the market, children chasing one another with dusty feet. Life went on, indifferent to my private sorrow. It felt cruel that the world did not pause when my heart had shattered. I rented a small room near Eastleigh, a place filled with noise and movement but empty of the warmth I once knew. My old house had a mango tree in the yard, its shade falling on the veranda where I would sit with tea in the afternoons. That tree, that shade, that veranda, all stolen from me by my own blood. In this new room, the walls were stained, the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the sound of traffic was constant. But the greatest emptiness was the silence inside me. I learned something about age then. People think growing old means you become fragile, helpless, waiting for others to guide you. But no, growing old means you have seen enough to know how deep pain can go and still survive. I had lived through losing my husband, raising a child alone, and teaching in classrooms where sometimes I wasn't even paid on time. Life had carved scars into me long before this betrayal. But this wound, this betrayal from my own daughter, it was different. It was a scar I could not hide, not even from myself. Every night, I lay on that iron bed and thought of the past. I remembered walking with her to school, carrying her lunch wrapped in cloth. I remembered her first day at university, the way her eyes shone with dreams. I remembered saving money coin by coin to buy her a new dress for graduation. My sacrifices had not felt like sacrifices then, they felt like love, pure and endless. And now, all that love had been used against me. I told myself, Amina, you are 70, but you are not dead. You still have your mind, your dignity, your truth. I repeated these words like a prayer, because if I let despair take root, it would swallow me whole. Sometimes, neighbors would knock on my door, curious about the old woman living alone. They would ask where my family was, and I would smile weakly, changing the subject. Shame is a heavy chain. How could I admit that my own daughter had abandoned me for money? How could I confess that I was too trusting, too blind to see the betrayal forming behind her gentle words? But hiding the truth did not erase it. At night, when the city grew quiet and the only sound was the barking of stray dogs, I would sit by the small window and let my tears fall freely. Nairobi's night sky is vast, sprinkled with stars that remind you how small you are. I would look at those stars and whisper, why, God, why give me a child only to take her away like this? One evening, I visited the market where I once bought groceries with her. The stall owners remembered me. They asked, Mama Amina, where is your daughter? We haven't seen her in so long. I forced a smile, saying she was busy with work. Inside, my heart bled. Every question was a knife. Every memory was salt in the wound. Yet, amidst the sorrow, something inside me began to shift. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The resilience of the women who sold vegetables under the hot sun, laughing despite their hardships. The strength of the old men who carried heavy loads, their backs bent but their spirits unbroken. Nairobi teaches you that survival is not optional. The city itself is alive, demanding, unforgiving, but it also whispers, if you endure, you will find a way. I began to see my betrayal not only as a curse but as a lesson. Life had shown me its ugliest face, but perhaps it was also giving me a chance to rise one last time. I told myself, your daughter stole your home, but she cannot steal your strength. She took your land, but not your soul. She abandoned you, but you are still here. I remembered my years as a teacher, how I would encourage children who felt hopeless. I would tell them, mistakes are lessons. Failure is not the end. Stand up again. How could I tell them such words and not live them myself? I realized that maybe this was my final lesson, not for students, not even for my daughter, but for me, to prove that, even at 70, life does not end at betrayal. So I began to write, on scraps of paper, in an old notebook. I wrote my memories, my feelings, my anger, my lessons. I wrote about being a young widow. I wrote about raising my daughter with bare hands. I wrote about the day she betrayed me. And as I wrote, I discovered that the pain inside me transformed into something else, into clarity. Words became my medicine, my confession, my silent revenge. Because every story I wrote reminded me I was still alive, still thinking, still strong. But writing alone was not enough. The injustice burned in me. Why should she walk free, enjoying money that was mine, while I sat in a leaking room, with empty pockets? Why should betrayal go unpunished simply because I was old? I began asking around, quietly, carefully. I learned how property sales were recorded. I spoke to an old friend from my teaching days, a man who had become a clerk in a government office. He told me where the land records were kept, how I could request documents, how every signature leaves a trace. His words lit a fire in me. Thought, for the first time in months, I felt purpose. I was no longer just a victim. I was a woman on a path. My daughter thought my age made me blind, but she forgot 70 years also make you wise. I knew patience. I knew how to wait, how to move slowly and quietly. She believed she had buried me under shame, but I was preparing to rise from that grave. I still cried at night. Yes, I still felt the ache of loneliness every morning when I woke up and there was no voice to greet me. But now, beneath the pain, there was something stronger, resolve. I whispered to myself, one day, you will face me again, and when you do, you will see that I am not the weak old woman you thought I was. I am your mother, and I have not forgotten. Asterisk. When I decided to seek justice, I did not know where to begin. Nairobi is a city where everyone is busy surviving, and survival leaves little space for sympathy. People hear your story, nod their heads, and move on. But my pain was too heavy to carry alone. I needed answers, documents, proof, something to show that what my daughter did was not only betrayal but a crime. The first step was to visit the land office. I wore my cleanest kanga, tied my headscarf neatly, and walked with my old cane to the government building. Inside, the air smelled of dust and sweat, papers stacked high on wooden desks, clerks moving slowly, as though time itself was heavy on their shoulders. I waited in line for hours. My back ached, my legs trembled, but I told myself, stay strong, Amina, this is only the beginning. When finally my turn came, I explained my situation to the officer at the desk. He looked at me with tired eyes, then at the forms in his hands. You need the transaction record, he said. But that will cost you. Cost me. I asked, isn't this my right? He shrugged. This is Kenya, mama. Rights are there, but speed comes with money. I had only a few shillings in my purse, enough for food for the week. My heart sank. I wanted to shout, to demand fairness, but I knew shouting would close doors instead of opening them. So I went home, defeated but not broken. That night, I could not sleep. I stared at the cracked ceiling and thought of all the lessons I had taught my students. Honesty, justice, the value of hard work. And here I was, forced to choose between hunger and truth. For a moment, I considered giving up. What good would it do to chase papers when my daughter was already far away, perhaps enjoying a new life in another country? But then I remembered my husband. He had always told me, Amina, when life tests you, do not fold. Bend if you must, but do not break. I whispered his words to myself, and strength returned. The next morning, I sold one of the 2 gold bangles I had kept for years. They were the last pieces of jewelry my husband had given me. Selling them felt like selling a part of my heart, but I told myself this sacrifice was not for vanity, it was for dignity. With the money, I returned to the land office. This time, the clerk smiled wider, his hands moving faster. Within a week, I held the documents in my trembling hands. There it was, my daughter's signature, my forged consent, the stamp that had stolen my home. I stared at the paper for a long time, as if by staring I could erase it. But instead of erasing, I felt something solid forming inside me. This was not just pain anymore, it was evidence. With the papers, I visited a lawyer's office in the city center. The lawyer was a young man, polished suit, shiny shoes, the kind of man who spoke too fast and smiled too little. He listened to my story while checking his phone. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, your case is difficult, Mama. Very difficult. Property has changed hands. The buyer is gone. Your daughter is abroad. We can fight. But, he paused, letting the silence press against me. It will cost you. Court fees, my fees, many things. I asked, how much? When he told me the number, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was more money than I could imagine. I left his office with my papers clutched tightly, walking slowly through the busy streets. People brushed past me. Cars honked. Life roared around me, but inside, I was quiet. Too quiet. I returned to my room, locked the door, and let the tears fall. It was not just the betrayal now, it was the system itself. Everything had a price, and justice seemed the most expensive of all. I whispered, God, am I foolish to believe in fairness at my age? Should I simply accept this as my fate? But again, my heart resisted surrender. I remembered the faces of my students, how their eyes lit up when they understood a lesson. I remembered telling them that knowledge was power, that truth always finds its way. How could I betray my own words now? So, I began asking around in my community. I spoke to churchwomen, to neighbors, to old friends from school. One of them, a kind woman named Beatrice, told me about an organization that helped elderly people who had been cheated out of their property. She said they were not perfect, but they listened. I went there the next day. The office was small, with posters about elder rights on the walls. A young woman welcomed me, her voice gentle, her eyes filled with something I had not seen in a long time, genuine concern. I told her my story, every detail, from the day my daughter asked for the signature to the night I discovered the betrayal. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she placed her hand on mine and said, Mama, you are not alone. We will help you. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. They introduced me to a volunteer lawyer. Not polished like the man in the city center, but sincere. He explained things slowly, with patience. He told me the road would be long, but there were laws in Kenya protecting elderly citizens from property fraud. He asked for no money, only my trust. As I left their office that day, holding my documents closer than ever, I realized something profound. Betrayal had stolen my home, but it had also shown me the truth about the world. There are those who use you, and those who stand by you. Sometimes, they are not your blood but strangers who see your pain and choose to help. At 70, I was learning new lessons about humanity. But the fight was only beginning. The first court hearing felt like walking into a storm. The building was old, with cracked tiles and peeling paint, but inside the halls, the air was thick with tension. People argued in low voices. Lawyers in black robes hurried from one room to another, and elderly men and women like me sat on benches, clutching files to their chests, as if they were shields. I held my documents close, my heart pounding. My volunteer lawyer, a man named Joseph, walked beside me. His calm voice reassured me, but I could see in his eyes that the battle ahead would not be easy. When my case was called, I stepped into the courtroom. The judge sat high above, expression unreadable. My daughter was not present. She had already left the country, but her husband's brother appeared, claiming to represent her interests. He was a tall man with sharp eyes, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who believed money could bend truth. The arguments began. Joseph spoke with passion, explaining how I had been deceived, how the papers had been signed under false pretenses, how I had been left homeless. The other side responded with denial, twisting words, suggesting that I had willingly given up my property. Their lawyers sneered as if an old woman's pain was a trivial inconvenience. I wanted to stand up and shout, "Do you think I do not remember? Do you think I am senile? I know what happened." She promised me security, not abandonment, but the rules of the court demanded silence. I sat quietly, my fists clenched, as men debated my truth as if it were a matter of profit, not dignity. The judge postponed the case. "More evidence required," he said. His gavel struck, and with that, my hope was pushed months ahead. Outside the courtroom, Joseph sighed. "Mama, this will take time. You must be patient." Patient at 70. Patience is not a choice. It is survival. I had been patient all my life. Patient with poverty, patient with grief, patient with betrayal. But patience in the face of injustice burns like fire in the bones. Weeks turned into months. Each time I went to court, I wore the same kanga, tied my scarf tightly, and carried my documents like sacred scripture. Sometimes the hearings were postponed because the judge was absent, sometimes because the other lawyer requested delays. Each time, I returned to my small room, exhausted but determined. The cost was not only time. I spent money on transport, on photocopies, on endless small fees that officials demanded. My savings thinned, and some nights I ate only porridge to stretch my shillings. My body grew weaker, but my spirit refused to bend. There were days when the weight felt unbearable. Once, after a particularly humiliating session, where the opposing lawyer mocked me for clinging to the past, I returned home and broke down completely. I wept until my chest hurt, until my breath came in gasps. I asked God, why am I still alive if my life is only pain? But then I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was wrinkled, my hair silver, but my eyes still held fire. And I told myself, Amina, you cannot let them win. Not after everything you've endured. In those quiet nights, I found strength not in anger but in memory. I remembered my husband's laughter, my students' curiosity, the small joys of life that had once given me purpose. I realized that seeking justice was not only about the house or the land, it was about honoring all the sacrifices I had made. If I gave up now, then every coin I saved, every tear I shed, every lesson I taught would lose its meaning. Sometimes strangers gave me courage. One day, as I sat outside the courthouse waiting for my turn, an old woman beside me began talking. She too had been cheated by her children. Her story was different, yet the pain was the same. We held hands, two mothers bound by betrayal, and in that simple touch, I felt less alone. Nairobi may be a city of noise, but in its heart are people whose quiet solidarity can heal wounds words cannot. Months later, progress finally came. Joseph presented the documents showing the irregularities in the property sale. The judge examined them carefully. The opposing lawyer grew restless, his voice sharper, his excuses weaker. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker on his face. It was only a small victory. The case was still ongoing, but it was enough to remind me that truth, though slow, still had power. Yet, revenge brewed silently within me. I told myself justice was my goal, but deep inside, I longed for my daughter to feel what I had felt: abandonment, humiliation, loss. I did not wish her physical harm. No. But I wanted her to know the emptiness of being betrayed, the loneliness of being cast aside. Perhaps this desire made me cruel, but I was only human. Betrayal hardens even the softest of hearts. In those days, I often walked to Uhuru Park, sitting on a bench beneath the jacaranda trees. The city's noise faded there, replaced by children's laughter, lovers' whispers, the rustle of leaves. I would sit and reflect on life's irony, how a mother could give everything to a child and receive nothing in return. But then I also thought of resilience, of how even trees stand tall despite storms breaking their branches. Perhaps I, too, could stand tall again by the end of that year. The case was still unresolved, but I was no longer the broken woman I had been when this journey began. I had learned to speak in court, to look officials in the eye, to carry myself with dignity despite poverty. Each delay, each obstacle, had forged me stronger, like iron beaten in fire. I realized then that my revenge had already begun, not in the courtroom, not in the papers, but in the fact that I was still standing. My daughter expected me to vanish quietly, to fade into silence. Instead, I had risen louder, prouder, unafraid. The fight was far from over, but so was my spirit. I whispered to myself one night, as the city lights flickered in the distance, "You wanted to bury me, child, but you planted me instead, and now, I am growing roots you cannot cut." The new year began with a chill in the Nairobi air. Morning mist covered the streets, and the city seemed quieter than usual. But inside me, there was no quiet. There was a storm. The storm of waiting, of fighting, of hoping that all the sleepless nights, all the hunger, all the humiliation, would one day mean something. By then, my case had stretched almost a year. I was tired, but no longer broken. My cane was still my companion, but my steps had gained a firmness they had lost months ago. When I entered the courthouse now, clerks and guards greeted me with recognition. I was no longer invisible. I had become a face they remembered, the old woman who refused to give up. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Joseph received word that my daughter had returned to Kenya, quietly, perhaps believing the storm had passed. She had come not to see me, but to attend to financial issues related to the property she had sold. News travels fast in Nairobi when money is involved. For me, it was a twist of fate, an opportunity I had prayed for without believing it would come. The court summoned her, and one morning, I found myself sitting across from my daughter for the first time since the betrayal. She entered the courtroom dressed in expensive clothes, her hair styled, her eyes hidden behind sunglasses, she removed only when forced to. When her gaze finally met mine, I saw no shame, no sorrow, only irritation, as if I were an inconvenience. "Mama," she said coldly, not as greeting but as accusation. My heart clenched. Memories of her childhood rushed in, her small hands clinging to mine, her laughter echoing in our old home, her tears when she fell and I carried her on my back. For a brief second, I almost softened, but then I remembered the empty room, the leaking roof, the nights of hunger, the humiliation of begging for justice. The softness hardened into steel. The judge asked questions. Joseph presented documents. My daughter's lawyer tried to argue, but her presence in court changed everything. Now she had to answer, not hide behind others. She claimed I had willingly transferred the property. She said I had understood everything, that I had given her the land as a gift. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. But when Joseph showed the inconsistencies in the papers, when he pointed out the missing witness signatures, the forged consent, her calm cracked. For the first time, I saw her face pale. I sat quietly, watching. A strange calmness washed over me. This was not the daughter I had raised. This was a stranger shaped by greed. And yet, seeing her squirm under the weight of her lies, I felt neither joy nor triumph. What I felt was something deeper. Vindication. My truth was finally being spoken aloud. The judge did not give a final verdict that day, but he warned her lawyer that the evidence was strong against her. The case would continue. But the tide had turned. I left the courthouse with my head high, my cane tapping the ground like a drumbeat of victory. Outside, people rushed by with their own burdens, but to me, the air smelled different, fresher, lighter. For months, I had carried the shame of betrayal. Now, it was shifting back to where it belonged. Still, the nights remained long. Even with progress, my heart ached. Sometimes I wondered, why did I fight so hard? Was it truly for the house, for the land? Or was it because I could not accept being discarded? I realized it was both. Property was survival, yes, but more than that, dignity was survival. If I let betrayal define me, then I would have died long before my body stopped breathing. The next few hearings were tense. My daughter tried new strategies, tears, excuses, even blaming others. Once, she looked at me in court and whispered, "Mama, stop this. You are embarrassing yourself." Her words cut deep. But then I thought of all the nights I had gone hungry, of the gold bangle I had sold, of the shame I had endured in silence. I straightened my back and whispered back, "No, child, it is you who brought this shame." Her eyes flickered, and for a moment, I saw fear. Not fear of me, but of truth. Joseph pushed harder. He called witnesses, brought in experts, showed every flaw in the fraudulent sale. Each hearing chipped away at her defenses. Each day, I felt the weight on my chest grow lighter. And yet, revenge is not a straight road. There were still setbacks. Once, a judge failed to appear, postponing the case by weeks. Another time, an official misplaced documents, forcing us to resubmit. Nairobi's system was slow, frustrating, sometimes corrupt, but I had learned patience long ago, and I used it now like a weapon. I would not tire, not bend, not break. One evening, walking home from court, I paused near Uhuru Highway. Cars rushed past, headlights bright against the dusk. I looked at the city and thought, this city has taken much from me, but it has also given me the strength to fight back. At 70, I am more alive than ever, because I refuse to be silent. My revenge was no longer just against my daughter. It was against the belief that old age meant weakness, that betrayal meant defeat, that poverty meant invisibility. Each day I fought, I proved otherwise. The final stages of the case were near, and I knew, whether I won or lost the property, I had already reclaimed something far greater, my dignity. The day of the final verdict arrived with heavy clouds in the Nairobi sky. It was one of those mornings when the air feels thick, as though the city itself is holding its breath. I dressed carefully, wearing the same deep blue kanga I had worn on the first day of court. My scarf was tied firmly, my hands trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of the moment. Inside the courtroom, the benches were filled. My daughter sat across from me, her lawyer whispering into her ear. She avoided my eyes, but I could feel the tension in her posture. For months she had tried to play confident, but now her shoulders sagged, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was afraid. The judge entered, and silence fell. His voice was steady, formal, but each word struck me like the tolling of a bell. He spoke of the evidence, the inconsistencies in the sale, the forged consent, the exploitation of an elderly parent. He noted the testimonies Joseph had presented, the documents we had fought so hard to gather. Then came the words I had prayed to hear. The sale was declared fraudulent. My rights were recognized. The property, though long sold, was to be compensated, and my daughter held accountable for the deception. In that instant, time seemed to stop. My heart pounded in my ears. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. For months, I had carried the fear that my truth would be buried under lies, but now, at last, it stood in the light. I looked at my daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, I saw cracks in her armor, not just fear, but something like shame. She tried to speak, but the judge silenced her. The gavel struck. It was over. Outside, people congratulated me. Some shook my hand, others simply smiled. Joseph stood beside me, his voice calm but proud. Mama, you did it. You stood your ground. But victory felt complicated. As I walked out of the courthouse, I thought not only of justice, but of the journey that had brought me here. I had lost much along the way. My savings, my health weakened, my peace disturbed. And yet, I had gained something priceless. The knowledge that even at 70, I could rise and fight. That night, back in my small room, I sat by the window and let the city lights wash over me. The streets below buzzed with life. Matatas honking, vendors calling out, children laughing in the distance. I thought of the home I had lost. The mango tree that no longer shaded my afternoons. I would not get that back. But I had reclaimed something greater, my dignity. Revenge had never been about destroying my daughter. It had been about showing her, and myself, that betrayal does not erase worth, that a mother's love, even when broken, can still rise into strength. She had taken my home, but she could not take my spirit. In the following weeks, word of the case spread in the community. Neighbors who once whispered in pity now greeted me with respect. Other elderly women came to me, sharing their own stories of being cheated by children or relatives. They said, Mama Amina, you give us courage. I never expected to become a symbol. But in a way, that was the sweetest revenge. My daughter wanted me silenced, erased. Instead, my voice had grown louder, inspiring others. One afternoon, as I walked through Uhuru Park, a young woman approached me. She had heard of my case and said softly, my mother was cheated too. I wish she had fought like you. You are proof that it's never too late. Her words filled my heart more than any compensation ever could. Still, there were nights when loneliness returned. I would think of my daughter as a little girl, her laughter, her tiny hands in mine, and I would weep, not for the loss of property, but for the loss of the bond we once shared. Betrayal cuts deepest not because of what is taken, but because of who takes it. But even in those tears, I found strength. I realized forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. I could forgive her for being weak, for letting greed consume her, but I would never forget. My scars would remain, but they would no longer bleed. As months passed, I rebuilt my life slowly. The compensation helped me secure a better room, modest but decent. I bought a small wooden table, a chair, even a potted plant for the window. These small things gave me peace. I discovered joy in simplicity. Morning tea, the sound of children outside, the pages of my notebook where I continued to write my story. At 70, I understood something profound. Revenge is not always about seeing your enemies suffer. True revenge is living with dignity, refusing to be erased, turning pain into power. My daughter avoided me after the case. Perhaps shame kept her away, or perhaps pride. It no longer mattered. I had released her from my heart. She was no longer the child I carried. She had chosen a different path. My path was now my own, and I walked it with head held high. One evening, as the sun set over Nairobi, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I whispered to myself, you survived, Amina. You rose from ashes they thought would bury you. You turned betrayal into strength, silence into voice, defeat into dignity. And with that whisper, I felt peace.